Welcome to Precision Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 98 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about unlocking the locked user accounts using a web page. If a user repeatedly enters the wrong password, the accounts are locked to prevent hackers from guessing passwords and making any sorts of dictionary attacks. In part 94 of this video series, we have discussed about unlocking user accounts using a SQL Server agent job. The SQL Server agent job was scheduled to run every 30 minutes, and it's going to unlock any account that's locked for over 24 hours. If you haven't watched part 94, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. In this video, we'll discuss about unlocking the locked user accounts using a web page that lists all the locked user accounts. From this page, the help desk agent can unlock an account by simply clicking on a button control. This is not as dangerous as running a manual update query, but still a manual process and may be inefficient. Let's look at this in action. So obviously the first step in order to achieve this is to create a stored procedure that lists the information about the locked user accounts. So let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. So here I have this TBL users table, and if you look at this table, it has got this is locked column, which will basically tell us whether if the user account is locked or not. Okay, at the moment, if you look at this sample data that we have here, there are 4 user accounts that are locked. Okay, now I want to write a stored procedure that returns the username, the email of the person, the locked date and time, when was the account locked, that date and time, and then the most important thing is the number of hours for this account is locked. Okay, and to get the number of hours, okay, I'm using datetime function. Now if you're new to datetime functions in SQL Server, I have a video series recorded on that as well, and I will have a link posted to SQL Server video series in the description of this video. Please check that if you're new. But then to understand this function, it's very simple and straightforward. I want the difference between two dates. That's when I use datetime function. Okay, now datetime function is very helpful in the sense it can give you the date difference in either minutes, hours, days, etc. So now I want the difference between the current date and time, which I get using getDate function, and when the account was locked. So between the current date and time and when the account was locked, I want the difference between those dates in the number of hours. So I'm using this hour parameter here. So this function will return me the number of hours the account is locked from the TBL users, and I want these columns of information only for those rows which are locked. That's why I'm using this where clause, where is locked is equal to 1. Okay, so obviously if I execute this select statement, see that I get the username, email, locked date and time, and hours elapsed, the number of hours since the account is locked. And if you look at two accounts 3 and 4, Jerry and Sarah, these accounts are locked for over 24 hours. Okay, so let's go ahead and display this information on a web form using a grid view control. So let's flip to Visual Studio. So this is the same project that we have been working with in this video series. Now to this project I have added a web form called lockedaccounts.aspx, and on this web form I just dragged and dropped a grid view control, and I have given this grid view control an ID of gv locked accounts. So I basically now want to execute the stored procedure from .NET application and display this data within that grid view control. Okay, so the first thing is I want to specify what columns I want to display within the grid view control, and the easiest way to do that is on the grid view control, click on this button control and click on edit columns. So it's going to show all the columns that we can add to a grid view control. So if you look at the columns that I have username, email, locked date and time. I'm going to make these 3 columns bound columns. Now we haven't spoken about grid view control yet in this video series. We will be talking about that in a later video session. Okay, so I'm going to add these first 3 columns, username, email, and locked date and time columns, as bound columns to the grid view control. And to do that, I'm going to select bound column and click add. So that's the bound column. Now look at this, the column that I'm going to display within the grid view control, you must specify 2 things. One is the header text, what you want the header text of that column to be. Since we are displaying username, I'm going to specify the header text as username here. And then this column that you are displaying in the grid view control, where is it getting the data from? Now when I call from my .NET application this stored procedure sp get all locked user accounts, this stored procedure is going to return data, like this with these column names, username, email, etc. Okay, so for the grid view control, username column in the grid view control, it gets its data from SQL Server column username. That's what we have to specify as the data field. So if you look at data, tab here, the data field is username. That's the name of the column. So two things we have to specify: the header text and the data field. I click OK. Along the same lines, I want to go ahead and add bound fields for the rest of the columns: email and locked date and time. So I add another bound field, and the header text I'm going to specify as email, and the data field is again going to be email. That's the name of the column that the stored procedure returns. And along the same lines, let me add another bound field, and that's going to be locked date and time. So let's call the header text as locked date and time. And what's the data field? Locked date time. So that's the name of the column. So let me copy that and paste it as the data field here. Okay, finally we have another column to display: hours elapsed. Okay, now even this one I'm going to use as a bound column, so I'm going to use another bound column for that, and hours elapsed, and obviously the data field. So let's go ahead and copy the name of the column there, hours elapsed. That's the data field. And finally, we also want another column in the grid view control, because we want to display a button control where the help desk agent can click on that button to enable the account. And to do that, I'm going to use a template field. We haven't spoken again about template fields in the grid view control. We'll talk about that in a later video session. So I'm going to add a template field. Okay, and I'm going to call the header text of this template field as enable. Okay, now what's a template field? When you use a template field in the grid view control, you will have complete control on what you place in that template field. We'll talk about those template fields in a very great detail when we discuss about grid view control. For now, we have just specified a template field. The header text is enable. Okay, and that's it. I click OK. Now look at this. It's displaying username, email, locked date and time, all these columns. And in addition to that, it's saying column 0, column 1, column 2, etc. That's because if you look at this grid view control, there's this auto generate fields which is checked. Okay, what does this mean? It's going to auto generate columns, and we don't want that. So I'm going to untick that, because I have specified what columns I want in my grid view control, and I click OK. We should get rid of the other columns that were there before. Okay, now within this enable template field, I want a button control. Okay, so since this is a template column, in this grid view tasks pane, you can see that there is something called edit templates link. So click on edit templates, and when I do that, I will be able to edit that column, enable column, which is column number 4. Okay, so item template. So what do you want in this template? I want a button control which the users can click to enable the locked user account. So I'm going to go to the toolbox and double click this button control, and look at that. I get the button control, and you can specify the properties of this button control just like how you would do for any other standard button control, though it is in this template column. So I'm going to specify the text of this button control as enable. Okay, at the moment that's the only property that I'm going to specify, and after I'm done that, click on that smart grid view tasks button, and look at that, end template editing. So I click that, look at that, I get the enable button for every column. Okay, so that's the change. We have just specified the columns that we want within the grid view control. Now we want to invoke the stored procedure and retrieve the data and display within the grid view control, which is simple ADO.NET code. So obviously to do that, we have to import system.data, system.data.sql client, and system.configuration. Okay, so those are the namespaces, and I'm going to write a private method. So private, and I'm going to call this void get data. That's the name of the function. And what is this function going to do? Simply execute the stored procedure, retrieve the data, and bind it to the grid view control. So the first step is to read the connection string from web.config file, and to do that we use the configuration manager class. So configuration manager dot connection strings of, we need to specify the name of the connection string. And if you remember, in web.config file we have a connection string with name dbcs. So let me take that connection string and pass it to this connection strings property. Dot connection string. So we get the connection string. Next I use the using statement and create a SQL connection object. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection, and we specify the connection string property. Okay, so since we are using the using block here, the connection object will be closed immediately after the scope of the using block is over. Okay, so we have the SQL connection object. The next one is the SQL command object. So SQL command cmd is equal to new SQL command, and we want to execute a stored procedure. So the name of the stored procedure is spget all locked accounts. So I'm going to pass in the name of the stored procedure, and the next property that you have to specify is the connection object using which we want to execute the stored procedure. So I specify that, and since this is a stored procedure, we have to specify the command type. So command.command type is equal to command type dot stored procedure. And now this stored procedure, does it accept any parameters? No, so we don't have to pass any input parameters to the stored procedure. All we have to do now is open the connection and execute the stored procedure. And look at this, this stored procedure is actually returning rows of data. So I use execute reader method of the command object. So execute reader, and then whatever it returns, I'm going to set that as the data source for our grid view control. So grid view locked accounts dot data source is equal to command dot execute reader, and finally call the data bind method. So data bind. That's it. We don't have to close the connection because we're using the using block there. That's it. So this method will actually execute that stored procedure, retrieve the data, and bind it to the grid view control. And what do I want to do when the web form loads up? If not is post back. So if this is the initial get request, I want to call this get data method. Okay, so with this, if I go ahead and run this now, we should be able to execute that stored procedure and get the information about all the locked accounts and display it. Obviously we are using forms authentication here, so I'm not able to get to that page directly unless and until I log in. So let me provide the login information. Test and test1 is the password. So login, and look at that, I get the exact same information that the stored procedure returns. In addition to that, we have this button, and if you look at the way this button is behaving now, look at this. This button is basically enabled for every locked account. Now let's say the organization policy is that you cannot unlock an account if it has not been locked for over 24 hours, then the enable button should be disabled, which means the help desk agent cannot enable an account that's not locked for over 24 hours. Okay, so we want to disable the buttons in those cases. How do we do that? Now, how do we disable a button? If you want to disable a button, every button has got a property called enabled property. All you need to do is, if I go to the source here, I have this button control, so I can simply set enabled is equal to false here. But if I set enabled is equal to false here, then what's going to happen? For every row within the grid view control, the button will be disabled. So obviously now if I go ahead and run this, as you might expect, when the grid view control renders, every button will be disabled. So let me enter test1, I log in, and look at that, every button is disabled. We don't want that behavior. We want to programmatically inspect the value of this hours elapsed, and if it is over 24 hours, only then do we want to disable this button. Otherwise, keep it enabled. So hard coding the value like this within the HTML source is not going to work for us. We have to dynamically determine the enabled property. And how do we do that? It's very simple to do it. Okay, now first of all, let's understand the logic on how we want to do it. So we have this column which is coming from the database, hours elapsed. That's the name of the column, which contains the number of hours the account is locked. If that hours is greater than 24, okay, then have that enabled. Otherwise, disable it. So what I'm going to do here is enabled is equal to, instead of hard coding the value here, I'm going to use this syntax, angle brackets, percentage, and hash. So what is that going to do? Now we can specify the data binding syntax here. So I'm going to use eval, that's the function, And then if you look at the column that is giving us the number of hours since the account is locked is hours elapsed. So I want the value from this column. So I'm taking the value from that column, hours elapsed. Okay, if that value, and by the way, you have to use a single quote here. So let's use a single quote for that. So I get that hours elapsed. Okay, and I want to convert that to an integer because number of hours is an integer. So I'm going to say convert dot toInt 32. So after I convert this value to integer and I am using a greater than symbol 24. So the value from this column, after you convert that to integer, if that is over 24 hours, if that expression returns true, then enabled will be true. Otherwise, if that returns false, enabled will be false, which means the button will be disabled. Okay, so that's the that's how we are dynamically determining if we want to enable or disable that button. So let me go ahead and run the page with this change, and when the user logs in, look at that. Now this button and this button are disabled, but the buttons where the hours are greater than 24 are basically enabled, and the user can click these buttons to basically enable those accounts. But now when I click these buttons, nothing will happen. That's because we haven't implemented that yet. We'll do that in the next video session. Another problem with this page is that any user who is logged into your machine, who is logged into this application, can basically access this page. We don't want that to be happening. We only want to allow specific users. For example, let's say I want only the administrator. For example, let's say within this application, test user, this test user is the administrator, and only he should be able to access. Anybody else who is trying to access this page, maybe we want to redirect him to an access denied web page. Okay, because that's a secure page, so we don't want access to everybody within the application. So how can I prevent other users from accessing this page? There are several ways. Okay, one way is you can actually move this locked accounts page to another folder, maybe to an admin folder, and you have another web.config file there, and you can have an authorization element there which allows access only to test user and then deny access to everybody else. That's one way. Another way, if you want to do it programmatically, in the page load event you can basically check, okay, so if it's not a post back event, if it's not a post back, if user.identity. So user.identity will give the identity of the person who is logged in. If the name, which returns the username, the logged in or authenticated username, .toLawyer. So I'm comparing that to a specific username. If that user is test user, that's the username. Okay, because if you look at the user here, username here, test. If he is a test user, then allow the page loading, get data, and all that. Else, what we want to do, we want to redirect him to an access denied page. I have already added an ASPX page with name access denied.aspx to this project, and all I have on this page is a very simple and straightforward HTML and H1 tag which says access denied. So that's the page. So I want to redirect the user to that particular page. So I copy that. So let me copy the name, and we can simply say response.redirect to that page. Okay, so now if we go ahead and run this, since I am logged in as test right now, I will be able to access that page because we said for test user allow this. But then if I close all these windows, let me run this application once again. Locked account. I'm going to log in as John. So John123 is the password. I log in. Look at that. The return URL is lockedaccount.aspx. After I log in, I will try to go to locked account, but look at what's going to happen. It is redirecting me to access denied page. Why? Because user.identity.name will return my logged in username, in this case John, and John is not allowed to this page, access to this page. So on the page load, we are redirecting him to access denied.aspx. Not only him, any other user apart from test user. That's why all users, if they try to access this page, they will get access denied page as response, but if test user logs in, he will be able to access that page. In the next video session, we'll discuss about how to enable, the implementing the enable button. In this video, we have just seen how to display the data about the locked user accounts, but in the next video, the help desk agent will be able to enable user accounts by clicking on that enable button. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.